Good afternoon everyone, and welcome to this webinar, which is a joint production between Masergy and Digital Law. Thank you all for joining us on the link that we have sent around within the last 10 minutes or so. If you're dialing in on the bridge on your phone, could we please ask you to mute your line for the duration of the webinar, but we will be doing some questions and answers at the end. So on that occasion, you'll then be able to unmute and ask us some questions as well, and hopefully we'll have some great interactive feedback from you, our audience. So today we're going to be talking about cybersecurity for a modern, digitally transforming law firm. I'm Peter Wright, and I'm the chair of Digital Law, which is a law firm based in the UK. We focus on data protection, cybersecurity regulation, and we basically advise our clients on anything to do with digital matters, so anything like e-commerce, social media law, etc. If it's digital, we advise on it. I'm also joined today by my good friend Craig from Masergy. Craig.
Hey everybody, good afternoon. This is Craig D'Avria. I'm the Vice President of Security Operations at Masergy. So just a quick little background on the company. We basically own and operate the largest independent software-defined networking platform in the world, through which we offer multiple services: hybrid networking, unified communication, and cybersecurity. Just based on my title, you can imagine I pretty much focus a lot on the cybersecurity side of our business. So I oversee our entire cybersecurity portfolio, managed security services, and within my purview, I oversee our global security operations centers based in London, the US, as well as Asia Pacific. Within our SOC operations, we have Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 security engineers that are constantly watching our customer environments on a 24/7 basis, looking for any kind of malicious attacks that are going on and helping them prevent cyber breaches from occurring, and really trying to identify when they occur. Just in general, Masergy has about 1,600 customers spread over 102 plus countries. So we do quite a wide variety of business across the globe.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed for that, Craig. And I should also mention that one of the reasons that we're doing today's webinar is it's very much a sort of curtain raiser for the British Legal Technology Forum, which will be taking place next week on Tuesday, the 10th of March in London at Old Billingsgate. And Masergy are a stage sponsor there once again. There'll be, I think it's the innovation stage that they are sponsoring, and that's a stage that I'm also chairing for the day. So I'm really looking forward to working with Masergy there, and Craig will also be speaking there as well. And that's where we sort of then thought, wouldn't it be great to actually talk about some of the cybersecurity issues that are currently a factor for the legal profession to consider. And that's very much where our agenda for today's webinar has come from. I was fortunate enough to attend a briefing that the UK National Cybersecurity Centre hosted a couple of weeks back that was specifically designed for members of the legal profession. So I was there along with representatives from some of the other law firms, from local law societies, from the Law Society in London, Chancery Lane, where I'm also chair of the Policy and Regulatory Affairs Committee, as well as a past chair of the Technology and Law Committee. And there are also representatives there from regulators like the SRA and others. And as a result, we got some up-to-date threat information, which we'll be talking about when it comes to latest trends in the legal sector there around cybersecurity. We'll also be looking at actually lifting the bonnet, as it were, on actually what happens when a cyber attack ends up impacting a firm. We'll end up looking at the risk overall to firms, managing that response, and also looking at some of the potential issues in the future in terms of the development of risks around cybersecurity, and some of the areas that, when it comes to managing risk, law firms and certainly partners and boards at law firms need to be thinking about in terms of keeping a track of their risk in this field going forward. So in terms of the sort of latest cyber attack trends to consider, I think it's very important to bear in mind that law firms remain very significant targets for hackers. Why is that? Well, you've got a very high volume of business transactions that our law firms undertake, as well as all of that very sensitive client data. All of those copies of passports and IDs that we have to take for our compliance purposes to comply with money laundering legislation, as well as, of course, being able to keep on top of our requirements when it comes to conflict of interest checks. As a result, law firms have all of this very sensitive data, but they don't really benefit from the big levels of security that, say, some of the large banks are able to throw at this, because law firms simply don't have the resources that some of the large multinationals have, particularly when you think there are about 10,000 law firms in England and Wales. The majority of those are sole practitioners, sole partners, or 1 and 2 partner firms, and simply the resources aren't there. So we're going to look today at some of the other alternatives that are there in terms of resource. But it's important to remember as well that it is now very easy for hackers to be able to undertake their craft, unfortunately. Generally, it costs less than £20 for a hacker to be able to go onto the dark web, that unpoliced area behind the web that we see that's made up of things like Google and Facebook and Amazon. On the dark web, you can easily acquire tools for less than £20 that would enable you to carry out quite sophisticated cyber attacks and potentially cause a significant amount of damage. So therefore, the risk grows when you don't have to be, we aren't talking about highly skilled people necessarily undertaking these cyber attacks. Very often it's those with just these basic tools, or indeed it's important to remember that an awful lot of attacks are carried out on an automated basis. An awful lot of these are coming from automated attempts to log into different sites, or even sending out all of those sort of spam emails, etc., that come out trying to get you to engage into sending information. Those are all, more often than not, artificially generated on a wide scale. One thing we also need to think about is the risk from things like LinkedIn. And I flag this up because at the National Cybersecurity Centre, they really focused on the fact that many firms invest huge amounts in really sophisticated systems to try and protect their systems, protecting their email, protecting their cloud. But then, of course, if someone ends up sending you an unsolicited connection request on LinkedIn, and you then start having a conversation on LinkedIn Messenger, someone could potentially send through to you, say, a spreadsheet or a document of some sort that could have who knows what in terms of malicious links, macros, etc. on there. And all it would take is that to then be downloaded and opened, and then they could then really cause havoc to your system. And in particular, they talked about the threat of people purporting to be recruitment consultants, and saying, you've been headhunted to join a new organisation. Can you please fill in this very detailed spreadsheet with all of your information? And then the hacker sends through this spreadsheet. The person thinks they're being headhunted, downloads the spreadsheet, enables all the macros, and then who knows what information they've then provided or given access to. And of course, by doing that through LinkedIn, you're circumventing all of those sophisticated cyber measures that you might have in place on your servers and on your email. And it's basically given a pipeline straight through all of that really sophisticated information. And finally, it's also important to think that many cyber attacks are actually carried out by very well-resourced criminal enterprises. Cybercrime is a business for many organizations. When they carry out things like ransomware attacks, they're looking to just purloin all of that personal data on there, lock it, and then charge a ransom in relation to that data being released. And therefore, indeed, they actually pride themselves on trying to provide a service and saying, we'll give you 48 hours to pay the ransom by Bitcoin, and then they pride themselves on returning that information once you've paid the ransom. But because these schemes have been very successful, they've ended up getting very well resourced in the process. So just going on to the next slide now, I just wanted to look a little bit at the sort of breakdown in terms of cyber attacks. And you can see there, for example, 56% of phishing is related to LinkedIn. And they've also got a number of other attacks there. So, Craig, do you want to just take us through the general breakdown there in terms of the sorts of attacks that we need to be thinking of? Can I just ask as well, I think someone might have their phone unmuted there, so if you could please mute it, and then we'll have questions at the end if that's okay. So if you just ask everyone to make sure their line is muted there. Craig.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Peter. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. So when I looked at a bunch of different statistics, as you know, of various organizations, for all kinds of stats on cyber crimes and the types of attacks that are going on and what's the proliferation and year-over-year growth and so forth, right? When we looked at phishing, almost every single every single person has had some type of phishing attack occur to them personally or within the organization. But when you look at the stats and you break down, what type of social media initiatives that are going on for phishing, almost 56% of that, as Peter had mentioned, is really related to LinkedIn. Recruiters trying to reach out, people trying to get you to add them to the network and so forth. And if you look at the second next category, it's closer to about 8%. So 8% to 56%, so huge amount of phishing emails through LinkedIn. And of course, from a phishing perspective, the attackers are trying to gain access to user credentials, other confidential information that a user may actually give out. The next big one, and I really wanted to call attention to this one, is ransomware. Now, ransomware is a subset of malware that is typically destructive in nature, kind of falls in the categories of virus, Trojan, adware, spyware, and so forth. But it has been so destructive over the last 3 or 4 years, and it's really been bringing down organizations across the globe, from small ones all the way to very, very large ones. On average, a ransomware attack, in terms of trying to get your data back, will cost a company about £133,000 on average. Now, from what we've seen, a good majority of them typically will not get their data back, and so it's just a way to try and collect money, from organizations. And we'll kind of get into an example a little bit more deeper, but it's pretty eye-opening to see how much that could potentially, cost. In terms of data breaches, now this would be accessing sensitive information across organizations in terms of customer information, employee information, intellectual property, and so forth. We've seen about a 54% increase in data breaches year over year. Just the second half of last year, we had about 4.1 billion records that were actually lost as a result of data breaches occurring. On the right-hand side, malware. Once again, you've probably all seen some form of malware within your organization or the law firms, and about 92% of that is actually delivered via email. From a distributed denial of service perspective, this is where attackers are trying to not give users legitimate access to specific resources. So websites, so portals, or e-commerce, or even client portal information. What they do is that they set up bots across the globe that will go ahead and attack a specific site or try to bring it down. And so while this has not been huge over the last couple of years, we've seen a little bit of a decline. About 50% of enterprises do experience some form of denial of service against their systems. And finally, I wanted to call out cloud vulnerabilities. So we've seen a major digital transformation to cloud-based systems over the last few years. The Azures of the world, the Amazons of the world. And while that's extremely useful and helpful from a cost-saving perspective and a scalability perspective, you got to keep in mind that there's a lot of vulnerabilities that exist. This could be from the APIs that are exposed to these cloud services, to actual account hijacking, the accounts that are used to administer the services, and finally down to the hypervisor. So as you're probably aware, most cloud systems are virtual in nature, and they run across a virtual hypervisor. Well, a lot of times hackers can take advantage of the hypervisors and start moving to other instances of machines within that specific cloud architecture. So we're starting to see a rise year over year in the type of cloud vulnerabilities, just simply based on the movement from a digital transformation perspective. So let's quickly kind of go through the anatomy of a ransomware attack. So typically, a malicious attacker is going to try and identify a user. It could occur in multiple ways. For example, LinkedIn, big one, where they may go and look at an organization that they're targeting, try to find out which persons or employees within that org, whether they're from an IT perspective or administrative perspective, what kind of systems they may have access to, and try and target that. The second type of attack is more of a blind type attack, where they're going to just send out a link that may be malicious in nature, that has attachments that Peter talked about, and somebody's going to click on it, and they're going to land into an actual target. So as soon as a user may click that malicious link or download that piece of malware, in step number 3, what occurs is that malware unpacks and pretty much executes on that user system. It could be a laptop, could be a mobile device, could be a desktop within the enterprise. As soon as that malware unpacks and embeds itself into the specific machine, it then reaches out to a command and control server somewhere on the deep web. Usually what they do is that they sit behind an encrypted and anonymous network, such as Tor, and they reach out to the attacker servers, they download the public key. And the reason that they download the public key is because when you look at an encryption system, there's two types of encryption. One is symmetric encryption and one is asymmetric encryption. In symmetric encryption, you basically use the same key to encrypt and decrypt data. In asymmetric encryption, you have a public key and a private key that is used to encrypt and decrypt data. So essentially, a public key is downloaded from the command and control server, and then it encrypts all the data on that specific user's host, and you have absolutely no access to the files or the folders on that machine. Typically what occurs is as soon as the files are encrypted, you have a screen that gets displayed that says, all right, go ahead and pay a specific amount of Bitcoin. If you do so, we will go ahead and release the actual key to you so that you can now decrypt your files. That's the transaction from a Bitcoin perspective on the delivery of the keys. And from the statistics that we've seen, about 80% of the time, companies typically do not pay the ransom. The 20% of them that do pay, 80% of that pretty much do not have a chance of actually even recovering the key. So it really goes back to clean hygiene, best practices, having backups in play in order to try and evade a ransomware attack. Like I said, this has occurred from small organizations to large organizations across the world, and it completely takes the org offline, sometimes for several months, since they have absolutely no access to the data. So let's talk about, pass the background to Peter, and we'll talk about how you can try to mitigate some of the risk and cyber attacks within your organization.
Fantastic, thanks, Craig. Just looking there at ransomware, I think it's important to think about examples where we've had that. Of course, there were those massive ransomware attacks with WannaCry and NotPetya in 2017 that I'm sure many of the listeners will be familiar with. WannaCry in particular took down the UK National Health Service. And indeed, the NHS was so vulnerable, largely because they were still using many machines that were operating on old versions of Windows that were no longer supported. And indeed, that support had lapsed by a period of several months, and the system was therefore very vulnerable to exploitation. And in spring 2017, that is exactly what happened. Huge amounts of data were therefore lost, and the system was heavily compromised. Operations were delayed, and it was impacted quite heavily. You would hope now, therefore, that being able to make sure all their machines are regularly patched and updated is high on the list of priorities, both with the NHS and across the public sector. Many organisations afflicted by these sorts of ransomware attacks then find that their entire systems have to be rebuilt from scratch. Sometimes it can actually be quite difficult to even find out the nature of the attack, the thing that's actually gone wrong, particularly if your entire system is you can't access it. Trying to find out what the problem is becomes, from a diagnostic perspective, incredibly difficult. I heard of one firm that was afflicted by this actually having to take the server that amounted to being ground zero, where the network was at first penetrated. They actually had to get a partner to fly that server to one of their offices, where they could then carry out a sort of forensic investigation to find out what they were actually dealing with. So, of course, that took a certain length of time just to find out what the actual problem was. But it's also important to make sure that you've got that good backup, which Craig was referring to there as well. Make sure those backups are there, and indeed test them. I heard of one firm where multiple backups failed, and they were literally left to, after a protracted search, they found one server in a backup facility in a branch small office that actually did contain a backup that worked, but everything else had gone down. So rather than just taking it on a promise that you know these systems are working, test on a regular basis. Make sure that your backups and redundancies work, because you don't want to find yourself scratching around to find something that works in extremis where everything has gone wrong. So in terms of how you mitigate risk, make sure that you've actually got a good policy in place. Make sure that policy has been tested, that everyone knows how it's supposed to operate. Don't just sort of leave it to gather dust somewhere and then trust that it'll all work when you need it, because funnily enough, you might then find that some of the named positions in that plan might no longer exist. You might have found that people have been promoted, jobs might have been changed, classifications may have changed, and all it then descends to is an argument and finger pointing, sometimes at quite senior levels in an organisation. Make sure that you've got multi-factor identification in place on your systems as well. Even from just accessing your corporate Twitter account through to accessing your email or cloud or other facilities, if MFA is on their multiple factor, then use it. It might be a little bit onerous where you might have to wait for a text message with a code to come through, or there might be another system like RSA with its key fobs. But if you can use that, your system's going to be so much more difficult to be hacked that it'll give you that extra layer of security. It doesn't mean it can't be hacked, but it just makes it much more difficult for someone to get into rather than just having to guess a few passwords to try and get in. Make sure as well that you aren't having passwords daisy-chained across different accounts. I am constantly amazed by the number of organisations that we go into and we try and help with regards to drafting policies for them and delivering training, and we find out that sometimes they'll have the same password on multiple different accounts. Just because it's an easy thing to do. And then, of course, you find that password is often written on a post-it note affixed to the monitor on someone's desk, at which point you think, well, why even bother? So make sure that you've got a series of different passwords. And indeed, the National Cybersecurity Centre today has actually issued guidance saying when you're putting your password together, just for example, pick three words that could be memorable to you, but are largely random, and that way you can ensure that you'll know what your password is. It's memorable to you, but again, much more difficult to guess rather than using, for example, just your birthday or your street name or the name of a pet, for example. All those things are very, very easy for hackers to guess and hack. Also, ensure that staff receive regular training. Interestingly, I've found recently that an awful lot of organisations, and bear in mind that we're recording this in 2020, an awful lot of organisations haven't really thought much about cybersecurity since before GDPR came in. So I'm finding when I sit down with a lot of clients, they'll say, oh yeah, we had some training in 2016. You're like, great, okay. The world has moved on a little bit since 2016. The world has moved on since 2018 if the last substantive training that your staff received was more data protection focused around GDPR. We always advocate regular training, about every 12 months or so that you can do an exercise like we're doing now and talk about up-to-date threats, how things have changed, where the real battlefronts are. So, for example, the issues we've talked about with regards to LinkedIn and ransomware just on this webinar. So that's sort of things from a policy perspective. I'll now hand over to Craig to look at some of the more technical measures to consider.
Absolutely. And there's always going to be that delicate balance between compliance and actually getting business done, right? To add those technical controls to your infrastructure. But everything starts with policy. You got to have policies in place in order to drive a lot of these technical controls. But some additional tips for protecting your enterprise: continue scanning. You've got to scan your internal as well as your external assets, right? Sometimes the external assets are a little bit more important because they're publicly facing and they're always getting attacked from the deep web, the internet, all kinds of automated sources externally, just looking for a way to get in. But internal patching and scanning is extremely important too. You've got to understand the vulnerabilities because for the most part, most of the attacks will happen at the actual desktop. Somebody clicking on a malicious link, opening up a backdoor, taking advantage of a vulnerability, and then spawning an attack that they'll propagate through the entire network. The second big thing is monitoring all environments, right? You want to be able to monitor all the traffic that's ingressing, egressing, which means going in and out of your network, and also traffic from your user base. So your users going to your server ranges and so forth. The goal for that is to be able to detect any kind of abnormal pattern. So if you do get compromised and an attacker is in your network, what exactly is he doing? Is he looking for the crown jewels or the customer database or the database that has intellectual property within your customer files? That's what they're going to go after. And as Peter mentioned earlier, law firms are a huge target because through a single firm, you now have access to so many different end customers, M&A type activity, patent type law, and so forth. So another big thing is logs, right? All the IT infrastructure systems produce some form of log, which will tell you which users have logged in, how often have they logged in, which locations have they logged in from. So constantly keeping track of your logs and running, monitoring analysis on an ongoing basis is extremely important. Most law firms have remote offices across the country or even globally. Some of them may be small in nature, 2, 3, lawyers or a few administrative staff out there. Well, by getting into some of these remote sites, it may sort of go undetected, and that's where the attackers will target. So make sure that you're also monitoring your remote offices. Mobile users, people are working from pizza, Costa Cafe, or a Starbucks or something like that. They're off the network, but they're still accessing systems that are critical to the firm from these mobile locations. They're jumping onto public Wi-Fi that's not really protected or can be sniffed by an attacker. So you got to monitor the mobile users as well. Cloud environments. With the digital transformation going to Azure, Amazon, using infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, there's inherent vulnerabilities. Those servers could also get breached within the cloud. So sort of running monitoring services around that and trying to monitor those logs, those events and traffic is huge. We're seeing a lot of SaaS, software as a service, come up as well, right? So organizations are moving to cloud-based services, the Salesforce to manage their CRM, their customer databases for scale and so forth, to monitoring those environments as well. I think EDR is a huge advantage to implement that across the board. Not only is it served from an antivirus perspective, but it also has some ransomware capabilities built in, anti-ransomware, to kind of help prevent some of those ransomware attacks from spreading. You can also shut down processes or take out machines off the network or users off the network if you detect something malicious is going on, down to the endpoint. It's extremely useful. Finally, penetration testing. Running assessments against the outside of your environment to look for those vulnerabilities. And as we've talked about multiple times in this webinar, backup, and really re-backup. You got to make sure that the backups are sent to an off-site location so that they are, they cannot be compromised. You got to check your backups. A lot of times we've seen ransomware attacks occur, and they've had, good backups, but they have been corrupted as well. So make sure you actually check and test your backups. And finally, there's a huge tie-in between the governance side of things, the technologies we talked about, and insurance as well.
There certainly is. Thanks for that, Craig. And the reason why we've got that little table just at the bottom there with governance, tech and insurance, we call that the cybersecurity triad. They're the three things that you need to have in place to demonstrate that you're complying with best practice and indeed, for example, complying or needing to demonstrate regulatory compliance with something like GDPR or to demonstrate that you're managing the risk from a cybersecurity perspective when it comes to managing risk within your law firm. Generally, you need to be able to say that you've got some of the technical measures in place. So some of the things that Craig's just been discussing, for example, making sure that you're doing things like pen testing, that you've got good endpoint detection and response, or that you have other measures in place. Governance in terms of some of the policies that I've talked about, in terms of things around your passwords, things around how you handle your data. So Craig was talking there about, for example, if you've got people working outside of the office, ideally you want to make sure that if someone is working outside of the office, they know that, for example, they shouldn't be going onto free public Wi-Fi. So if they're going to Costa or Starbucks, should they really be undertaking work in that environment, in particularly our sort of legal services? So do you want someone to be wading through really important information, looking at stuff with regards to their clients in a public environment where they could be overseen? Really, guidance does need to be given to staff on those sorts of points. And that's the governance that we have there, the second part. And then the third bit is insurance. It's always a good idea to have insurance. If you are on the end of a major attack, you're going to need some of the coverage that can be provided there, but check the terms. Don't just presume that because it says insurance for cyber attacks that it will cover all of your liabilities. Some of the, for example, the ongoing loss that you could have to turnover and profit, the costs of bringing your systems back up online, not to mention some of the regulatory costs that you might face from fines from the SRA or the Information Commissioner's Office. So think very, very carefully as a result about the coverage that you have from your insurance. And we would say have all three of those things. If you've not got all three, arguably your system might collapse because you've got a major vulnerability as a result. And make sure the whole thing, of course, is underpinned by good training. Absolutely essential that you've got good regular training. Not a tick box. Not just watch this 15-minute film and answer a few questions, something that makes staff think about their day-to-day roles, the activities that they are undertaking, and then the risks that will flow from that, and then actually get staff to think about the measures that they need to take to address them. So let's have a look at what a cyber response program and plan looks like. Can I just ask if anyone's got their line unmuted there? Please do mute it so that everyone's able to hear and enjoy the webinar, and then we'll have some questions later on that you'll be able to ask through the line. But please mute for now. Thank you very much. So what does a cyber response program and plan look like? It's important to have a proper unified plan in place here. Don't forget that those initial hours and minutes after an attack has been hit, you're going to have to carry out a huge amount of activity. You might be having to go and talk to law enforcement. You could be speaking to your insurers. You could be trying to reassure clients. It could be that you'll have different staff who will be assigned key things to do when it comes to notifying clients or speaking to partners in terms of, for example, your bank, in terms of other key contractors that you work with. You'll have an awful lot of work to do. And if you've not thought about who's going to be responsible for what, bearing in mind that if your system's on its knees, you can't then send around group emails saying, right, this person's to do this, that person's to do that. You've got to have had this worked out beforehand, and also you want to have copies of this plan available so that if your system has gone down, people know where to go and find it without having to use a system that is no longer available for use. And this all comes down to culture. Making sure that people are aware of the risks, they're managing them, they're doing something about them. Very much has to be something not just from making sure that everyone who's undertaking day-to-day roles is familiar with this. It has to be demonstrated from the top. That means partners, senior partners, managing directors, chief executive officers all need to be making sure they are following best practice. It's no good saying, right, we've sent off the junior staff to do their CPD training on this, but we can ignore it. And you'd be amazed by the number of cyber attacks that I've come across where they've been caused by senior managers clicking on links or taking risks that they didn't even realise that they were taking because they had absented themselves from the training and felt it was just something that everyone else had to do, not them. Now, when it comes to your training, when it comes to thinking about this, it shouldn't just be a death by PowerPoint exercise. Do something interactive. The National Cybersecurity Centre has interactive tools that you can use. They've put together a toolkit that boards can use if they take some time to actually think about what are you going to do if the worst happens, start thinking about your response. They've put together a toolkit. They've given you exercises to follow and lists to think about in terms of how you would respond in the event of an attack. They've also done exercise in a box, which is a separate exercise which you can then use to walk teams, managers and boards through a simulated cyber attack and response. Both of those things can be used to get board members, to get staff thinking about what are you going to proactively do in the event that there is an attack. So the tools are there, they're freely available. Go along and take a look at ncsc.gov.uk there. And think quite carefully then about 3 measures that you'd need to think about in the event of a major cyber attack. First of all, gathering information. What are you affected by? What's actually ended up meaning that what actions are you going to take to find out how you've been compromised and who's going to be responsible, who's going to get the evidence together, and who's going to start putting your response into action. So you need to gather information. Prioritise. Not everything can be done at the same time. Some things will be more important than others. For example, the police, speaking to the insurer, getting your staff together, reassuring them. You'll have to work out a balanced approach. But this means that good security is very much more than just a tick box exercise. And then take action to manage that risk. Assume that something is going to go wrong. And the NCSC themselves say, don't think it won't happen to me. Think it's going to happen. Therefore, have a plan in place. Hope for the best, plan for the worst. A full simulation might take time and resource, but it will certainly demonstrate adequate preparation. And think about that as well. If there is the worst sort of attack that you end up being hit with, you will have to then turn around and think, well, at least if we'd done a plan, we could demonstrate that we'd thought about this and we'd done all that we could reasonably be expected to in the event of an attack. So if you then do find yourselves having to report this to the SRA or the ICO, you can then turn around and say, we did do these exercises, we had put plans in place, and it worked as well as it could have done. We'd done all the preparation we could have been expected to. And regulators tend to like that. If you're turning around and saying, well, I'm sorry, we didn't do anything, they're going to be markedly less impressed than if you turn around and say, well, we did have measures in place, we did have a plan, we were trying to follow it, and we had tried to minimise the risk to our firm and to our clients and to our data. That will put you in much better stead and hopefully prevent you then being on the end of any regulatory fines as a result. So that's very much what it comes to there. Craig?
Yeah, just to add to it, right? Just running tabletop exercises, as you mentioned, and just kind of getting all the parties as part of the plan in place, right? So a lot of our customers, what they do is they'll set up a couple days simulation. They'll bring in legal, they'll bring in the IT staff, they'll bring in the PR side of things, and sort of just simulate an actual attack going on. Because as we all know, it's not a matter of if it's going to occur, right? It's definitely going to occur, but when is it going to occur, a cyber breach, and how do you respond to it? So running those tabletop exercises, really understanding, who's responsible for what's the chain of command, how do you execute the entire thing is so important, and make sure you get all your vendors, all your critical infrastructure, parts together, all the important parts of the firm, and just run that. Take a day or two in, maybe a couple times a year, just to run through so that it's fresh and at the top of everybody's mind. Because as you know, when a cyber attack occurs, it moves fast. You lose information extremely fast. You're going to try and contain that as quickly as possible. So can't stress enough how important it is to run these. Have a plan, but also be able to execute your plan and test it regularly. Thank you. All right, so I think pretty much down to the last piece, which is where cybersecurity is going next.
Yes, so a few things just to consider in terms of where the risk is likely to lie in future. We're already hearing about a lot more use of IoT, Internet of Things. We keep being told about the fact that everything from the kettle to the toaster will have microchips in them, and that they'll be connected and online. And you'll be able to ask, already you might be asking your Amazon Echo to dim the lights or to carry out different activities for you. We're being told about internet-enabled fridges that will allow you to, for example, your fridge will make sure that you've got milk in stock without you even having to go to the store. All these things are just around the corner. Now, this was on the way already. There's going to be more of it. You might have read about the fact that the UK government has adopted a zero carbon by 2050 policy. This means that there's going to be an awful lot of use of sensors and devices to try and manage and efficiently manage the use of energy in many different aspects of life. So many office buildings will end up having more sensors in each room, so that if they can work out, for example, that someone isn't in a certain room or part of the building, they can, for example, turn the air conditioning down, turn the lights down, turn the heating down, and therefore maximize the amount of energy that the room and the building is overall requiring. Now, you might think, so what? Well, it's the fact that as we end up doing this more and more, and different buildings and organisations try and reduce their overall carbon footprint to meet that zero carbon by 2050 target that the government is going to be pushing and enforcing, don't forget. And I don't think people have really thought about the consequences of that, which are going to become very real-world consequences in just a few years' time. It means we're going to have more of these devices. But do not presume, and again, the NCSC put out information this morning about the fact that many child monitoring systems are easily hacked and compromised, that many of these IoT technologies will also be easily compromised. Don't presume that just because someone's selling this brilliant system that will reduce your carbon footprint, that they haven't actually made sure that it can't be compromised. And if it's all attached to a single network, it could be that if that's the same network that's handling your business activity, someone can actually gain control of all of the IoT sensors, and then from there they are able to then gain command and control of the rest of the system. Even now, one of the main vulnerabilities on our network is very often things like the printer and other devices like that are connected and can be easily compromised if there isn't any existing security on that hardware, and very often there's not much security on there at all. Think as well about the fact that we've got increasing amounts of information being stored in the cloud. We're migrating more and more to these things. Think as well about when you've got clients who are wanting to engage more on social media. We've talked about the link from WhatsApp, from LinkedIn, but also WhatsApp is equally vulnerable to a certain extent. And the NCSC is regularly issuing updates with regards to vulnerabilities that it finds on WhatsApp. So just because a client wants to work with you on WhatsApp or some other message system like Telegram, don't automatically jump and say, yes, absolutely, we'll do that. Actually try and make sure that they communicate with you using your secure methods that you've established for your firm to be able to undertake business with your clients. And ultimately, more of these systems, more data being created, and the more data that's out there, the more vulnerable we become as a result. Craig, do you want to move on to some of the more technical points there?
Yeah, absolutely. So just all the collection and the more and more data that's coming out there, as you know, it's going to be humanly impossible to run analysis and try and correlate all of this together, right? So that's where we're going to see cybersecurity really move towards, and we started seeing the shifts already. Cognitive security, machine learning, utilizing things like TensorFlow and big data modeling to really understand and correlate information across all these different log, sources that are coming in. And they're coming in different types too, right? You have log data, you have packet data, you have net flow data coming in, you have data that can be accessible from a cloud perspective, used through APIs. And so we're starting to see this notion of AI ops really come through, where AI ops is really working with different and disparate data sources. It includes traditional IT monitoring, log events, application, network performance anomalies, and essentially all these data sources are processed together using mathematical models to identify significant events and anomalies automatically. Now, you're still going to need human, intelligence interaction to map that to the business processes and the business environment, but you're starting to see more and more machine learning and artificial intelligence used within cybersecurity. The next point on quantum technology is actually pretty interesting. As you know, we've made some quantum leaps, excuse my pun, within quantum technology, and especially around encryption. So, for example, quantum technology allows you to decrypt, encryption technologies really, really quickly. And so that's one side of things. But the other side of the equation is that, as Peter mentioned, you're using more IoT devices, sensors. They're small in nature. They don't have a lot of compute powers. But with quantum technology, you now have the ability to encrypt data a lot quicker on a smaller hardware footprint. And with these sensors coming on, it's something that's going to be very useful for security. And then finally, we're seeing a lot of synergy between networking and security, right? It's sort of this notion of you bring all your data together, and that's going to consider the plumbing behind it. How do you bring data into a specific environment, but then apply security principles and the security stack to it so that you have complete visibility across the board. In fact, this is going to be a big portion of our talk at the British Legal Technology Forum that Peter had mentioned earlier. So hopefully you all get a chance to join in, and we'll have a lot deeper discussions on the future of network security and how really all of it is moving towards the cloud.
Fantastic. Thanks so much indeed for that, Craig. So yes, we have the British Legal Technology Forum coming up. That's at Old Billingsgate in London on the 10th of March 2020. Masergy, you've got your a booth at C11 in the main hall. It's a very large main hall, so make sure you go to C11, drop in and say hi. Craig will be flying across the pond to be there, and will of course be presenting his session as well. And Craig, I think you're also on there's a panel discussion as well in the afternoon, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. So the panel is going to be about technology disruptions and basically disrupt or be disrupted. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation across multiple disciplines within the legal technology side of things, all the way from artificial intelligence to cybersecurity, to some new innovations that are coming out. So looking forward to seeing you all over there.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. And just in terms of if people want to connect with us online, I'm on Twitter at Digital Law UK, if you want to find me on there. I'm also on Facebook, facebook.com/digital law. Craig, are there any particular channels that people can use to connect with you or connect with Masergy?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're on Twitter, personally at Craig Diabrio. We also at Masergy on Twitter. Please visit our website at masergy.com, masergy.com, and feel free to reach out to us. We're also going to be recording this webinar and posting it online, so feel free to share this with your colleagues, anybody else who will be able to benefit from this conversation.